Welcome to Picture This, and this is episode 4, and today we're going to be talking about photographers you should know.
4 photographers that we thought were both noteworthy and had interesting stories. Certainly not the 4 most famous photographers in the world, maybe not even the 4 that contributed the most. If you have other photographers you'd like to see covered in future episodes, feel free to nominate them down in the comments if you happen to be watching on YouTube.
Yeah, we'll do another episode on this because there were so many photographers we wanted to cover.
Of course.
As always, this episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the easiest way to create a beautiful website, blog, or online store for you and your ideas. Squarespace features an elegant interface, beautiful templates, and incredible 24/7 customer support. Try Squarespace at squarespace.com/Tony and use the coupon code PORTFOLIO to get 10% off.
We both host our portfolios on Squarespace, and it makes them look awesome. Let's start with our first photographer, Chelsea, somebody you researched, Arnold Newman.
Arnold Newman. I chose Arnold Newman because I first started seeing his pictures when I was taking photography classes in college. Mm-hmm. And his Stravinsky picture, just blew me away. I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah, so this is Stravinsky, a pianist, and he's sitting at his, you know more about pianos than I do, but I assume it's a grand piano.
Yeah.
And the big cover that's on the piano is tilted upward as it is. But what makes this picture so remarkable is the geometry of the composition. The wall is divided with the rule of thirds, and then the top of the piano is at about a 45-degree angle. And he's in just the very lower left corner, sort of violating all rules of space. But the way the space works and the negative space works, it's really just a striking picture even today.
Yeah, you can see the uncropped version as well online, and it's amazing that he took this picture and then saw this in the crop. It was amazing that he could even just see it and just mark it off and then fix it or alter it in the darkroom.
Yeah, most cameras of the day took square pictures, so cropping was standard. It was just kind of how everybody shot everything.
So he was born in 1918 and died in 2006, quite recently. And he was born in New York City, but he moved down to Florida and studied at the University of Miami. He was a relatively new photographer on the scene when he had his first solo show titled Artists Look Like This. And it was exhibited at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it got national attention right away. He had this really amazing style for what people are calling now environmental portraits, where he would not only take a picture of his subject, but he would take a picture of them in their working environment. He took a lot of pictures of other artists like Ansel Adams. I think why you should know him is, first of all, his pictures are just traditionally beautiful. You could see by the piano picture that he used great compositional skills, and he clearly just had a great eye. But one of the reasons I think that everyone should know him is that he adds so much to his portraits. You're not just looking at someone's face. I've seen so many portraits of famous people where they're isolated and you're forced to just kind of look at their features. He puts them in an environment where you see so much more of their life. Ansel Adams, he took a portrait of, they were friends, and you can see that this is at his house. And you're seeing him in a whole new way. He's got his smock on for the darkroom. You can see parts of his house. You can see the art on his walls. You can see the wildlife outside his door, and it's so much more personal. You're not just looking at someone's features, you're kind of looking at their life, and you're learning so much about them. When I was first studying him, I thought that was powerful, but I didn't really realize how powerful his portraits were until I saw his portrait of Alfred Krupp. Do you know who that is, Tony?
Only vaguely.
Only vaguely. So
based on the picture, he doesn't look like a very nice guy.
Well, that's what's really amazing about the picture. So someone comes to Arnold Newman and they say, Alfred Krupp wants you to take his portrait. And Newman says, no way. Do I want to take that guy's picture? Because first of all, Arnold Newman is Jewish, and Krupp used slave labor in his factories, including Jewish prisoners from concentration camps. And he was imprisoned after World War II for crimes against humanity, for using children as slaves and using Jewish prisoners as slaves. And even after the war was over, he continued to use these young Jewish girls as slaves in his factories. Wow. His family's company supplied weapons to the Nazi regime during World War II. And he's a terrible guy. So, of course, Arnold Newman being a decent human being and also a Jew, did not want to take a picture of him, didn't really want anything to do with it. But then he kind of had some ideas that maybe with his picture, he could influence how people thought of Alfred Krupp. So he went to the factory and he started setting up for the picture. And of course, he was doing his environmental portrait thing. You can see that the factory's in the background. If you're listening to the audio version, Alfred Krupp is in the foreground. And he leaned in for his picture. And Newman says that the light just hit him in such a kind of evil, unflattering way. And he crossed his hands and he said, "Stay just like that." And then he took this picture that looks very menacing, right? It almost looks like a picture of the devil.
Yeah, nowadays it's not an uncommon lighting technique, but he's sort of backlit and cross-lit, so the light's coming from behind him and from the sides. So it's lighting up the sides of his face, but not his eyes. His eyes are dark, and the line from the forehead down through the tip of his nose to a chin is dark. And he's doing this very like
Mr. Burns hands or something.
Yeah, exactly. Just like Mr. Burns in The Simpsons, leaning forward on his crisscrossed hands with just this decaying looking factory in the background filled with working people, and he's wearing a suit. So there's also that sort of juxtaposition.
Yeah, well, there's actually a video of Arnold Newman on YouTube talking about taking this portrait. He's a fairly recent, he died in 2006, so, you know, we had some time to talk to him about these incredible pictures. And he says that Alfred Krupp was not too happy with the picture. Naturally.
I wonder how they related at the time he was taking the photo.
It sounded like it was all very professional and cordial. And in fact, it sounded as though he didn't want to be conspicuous with his intentions. And so he just kind of said, "Oh, lean forward a little more," and kind of led him into this unflattering light. And, "Oh, yes, your little evil hands look great like that. Like, keep it up." And then got his picture. But that, to me, that picture alone and that story behind that picture was what made me think he's a photographer you have to know. He could have gone there and just made a picture that was just typical and expected, but he put himself behind the picture and he put his feelings and his political views behind the picture, and his art came first. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and he was skilled enough to arrive there and take a picture that showed what he was feeling without the person even knowing. Yeah. Just got them to pose in a sinister way without suspecting it at all.
Kind of wondered how much of that was luck too, but I guess I won't know at this point.
Yeah.
I also read a lot of interviews with Newman, and in one of them he said something that summed up perfectly why I wanted to make this podcast. The interviewer asked him, "What kind of advice can you give to new photographers trying to get a break in the market?" And Newman said, "Well, I hope before they become new photographers that they start studying the past, going back as far as cave drawings. Painting and photography are intertwined. First of all, you have to know the difference psychologically, physically, and all that sort of thing. They should really study the past, then study the present to see what's good for you, then work your ass off. I'm astonished to find now that a lot of young people don't know the past in photography. I've actually had some of them ask who Stieglitz is. Do you know who Stieglitz was? Don't you?" And I didn't. I was really embarrassed.
Me either.
I was like, "Oh, Tony, do you know who this is?" Well, first of all, this is uncanny because that's the exact reason that I made this podcast, that we made it. We decided a part of learning is putting all of your photography knowledge into context. Why does the technology that you're using matter? Why do the pictures that you're making matter? You have to make them matter. And the other reason that I found it uncanny is that our first episode talked about cave drawings.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny. So, who is Stieglitz? Is that how you say it? Alfred Stieglitz. He is not as known for his photography as you would think. Something that really surprised me studying him. He was born in 1864, died in 1946. He was born in New Jersey, and then at the age of 17, his family moved him to Germany, and he studied there. He ended up taking a chemistry class with Hermann Wilhelm Vogel. He discovered color sensitization in 1873, which made color photographs practical. So at the time, they would try to process colored photographs, and the emulsion formulas, the chemicals, would not process all of the colors in the same way. So you'd get like blues and greens, but not reds, or the colors just weren't right. And he worked on the chemistry and basically got the colors to balance, and also got color photography to be like easy to manage. In other words, it became practical, as I said.
Mm-hmm.
So he met him as a professor, and shortly after bought his first camera. So he goes to Germany and he starts meeting these professors and these other artists like Adolf von Menzel and Wilhelm Hassmann. And they were notable artists, and they talked to him about not only art history, but about how the camera was going to influence art in their present era. Now, I thought this was interesting because I'm thinking, how does this kid meeting all of these influential people? And then I find out that his father is mega rich and is giving him an allowance of $25,000 a month. And, you know, that's what it would be equivalent to now. So you go to, imagine being 17 and you go to Germany.
Yeah,
and
you'd make
parents,
a lot of friends if you had $25K a month after taxes.
he was like going to operas, and I mean, he was having a great time. He was hanging out with all the ladies. He was meeting scientists, other artists. He was connected. He bought his first camera and he just started traveling around and taking pictures. And his photographs were accepted right away. He started winning awards and people liked his art. And he was really determined to make photography an art. I think at that time it was seen more as documenting or too sterile, or like it was just capturing the truth, so it wasn't art.
Yeah.
And he was more concerned with bending it in a more artistic way. And he was really advocating for making photography an art, a fine art, like painting, like sculpture. So getting into why he's important, he leaves Germany. His father forces him to leave Germany, threatens to cut off all the money. He goes back to New York and he gets a job as a co-editor of the American Amateur Photography magazine. And there he makes his most notable mark, not just at the magazine, but this is where he starts to kind of become a very influential person. He's not only writing about photography, he's writing about painting, and he's writing about art in general, and he's kind of lumping photography in with all the fine arts. So he's the person that is responsible for bringing photography into the fine art world, bringing it into galleries. He starts curating other people's work. He gave Ansel Adams a solo show before he was even really well known, which was unheard of. This guy had incredible connections in the art world, and he wasn't afraid to be bold and to find new artists and just scoop them up and give them a name. So in 1936, he gave Ansel Adams a one-man show in his New York gallery, and people loved it. He was one of the people that helped make Ansel Adams' career.
This guy has a great resume.
Oh, yeah.
If you run a gallery, yeah, seeing Ansel Adams before he was famous and showing him off, great eye.
Yeah, he was an art dealer and he was a publisher. He ended up having his own magazines that he was putting out, but he was also an advocate. He ended up marrying Georgia O'Keeffe. Well, he was kind of a playa too. So his father wanted him to have his own business, so he was writing for these magazines and things, but he wasn't really making money. He ended up marrying this young, wealthy girl and didn't really love her, but she was kind of bankrolling all the stuff, you know.
A sugar mama.
She was a sugar mama. And while he was married to her, he met Georgia O'Keeffe, and they had an affair. One day when he was taking nude pictures of Georgia O'Keeffe, his wife came home and discovered everything, kicked him out. The Georgia O'Keeffe nude pictures went on to sell for millions of dollars, and he had a long relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe. And then towards the end of their relationship, well, not really the end, but he started having an affair with another young girl, which Georgia O'Keeffe, she thought she wasn't really too hot on that.
Yeah, I'm sure, yeah.
But anyway, so why is he so notable? Well, a lot of well-known photographers and people in the art world credit him to bringing photography into the fine art world. So he took great pictures, but he also cared about other people's pictures, which made the art world care about him. So this is a photo of Georgia O'Keeffe with her hands up by her face. This is one of his famous pictures.
Yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful portrait because of the way the hands are posed. But even nowadays, the composition of it would be considered progressive. Her eyes are very close to the top of the frame, and most of the frame is filled with the intricate way her hands are posed. Very careful, very thoughtful portrait, and perfectly exposed.
He did a lot of experiments with taking pictures of hands, and Georgia O'Keeffe was his muse, and he took hundreds of pictures of her. And people say that that was the best point in his career. He was so inspired by her, and he considered her to be his soulmate. He was always looking for his other half to share his love for art, and she was it. And then I also included a picture of the young girl that he had an affair with on Georgia O'Keeffe.
Yeah,
she was
just so we can have that image. I can see that she's younger than Georgia
she's very
O'Keeffe.
young.
She's pretty.
Like 22. And
she has a very simple look about her, but
he was in his 60s, I think, and she was in her early 20s. And at first, he just started off as a mentor, and then they developed a romantic relationship. But yeah. So yes, you should also know him.
Even though he was a little bit, ew.
Well, my
With all
dear
the affairs
friend,
and everything.
and you know Siobhan, but she said once, and I thought that it was pretty smart, all of your heroes are monsters. And that's pretty much true. Dig deep enough with anyone that you like, and you're going to be appalled.
Yeah, I have some of that in the two characters that I'm going to be profiling. Well, actually, the second one comes up pure white, but Jacob Riis that we're going over next.
He's a monster?
There are definitely some questionable aspects to his personality. But first, why don't you tell him who sponsors this?
This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the easiest way to create a beautiful website, blog, or online store for you and your ideas. Squarespace features an elegant interface, beautiful templates, and incredible 24/7 customer support. Go to squarespace.com/Tony and use the coupon code PORTFOLIO to get 10% off of your purchase. You're gonna like it.
Squarespace it's like the modern art gallery. It's a way to put your pictures on the internet and make them look absolutely fantastic. It can bring your photos to the entire world, and it does a much better job than something like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, 500 pics, any of that. There, your pictures are just muddled in with other people. They control the format. On 500 pics, you get to choose exactly which pictures
Squarespace?
you present. Yes, on Squarespace, you choose which pictures you present, how they're laid out, what the background is like, your typefaces, whatever, as much or as little as you want to customize, you can. And we both use it, and it ends up looking awesome. It's less than $10 a month to get set up. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring us.
Tony, who did you choose?
Jacob Riis. He was born in Denmark in 1849. He was number 3 of 15 kids. And they were not a wealthy family. He had some hardship in his life, and I think that helps to establish the work that he goes on later to do. So when he was 11, his younger brother, number 4 of 15, drowned. And that, of course, devastated his mother.
Yeah.
Though not so much that she didn't go on to have 11 more kids, I suppose. But even at a young age, at least...
But did the child drown before she had more children?
Yeah, because he was number 4 of 15. The one who drowned. Oh, I see what you mean. How old was he?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe she stopped at that point.
Okay.
I don't have the timeline of all of his siblings.
Sorry. Just trying to figure it all out. He looks cool.
When he was 11, there was a poor family in the neighborhood, and he wanted to improve their living conditions because they kind of lived in squalor and everything was all mussy. And so he said that he would give, it was a weird arrangement. He would give all of his 11-year-old money to them if they would clean up their home. It was like this charitable act, but with a condition.
Oh.
And so his mom said, okay, I'll tell you what, I will help them clean up their home. And they did. They got the home cleaned up, and then he gave them all of his money. This is foreshadowing. This
is a weird thing. So this 11-year-old child goes to his poor neighbors and says, I'll give you money, but clean your house.
It is a weird thing. And I don't know, maybe people in Denmark are like, yeah, no, that's just something people do here. That's acceptable here. But I also need to say, I'm just going to say this up front, most of the information about Jacob Riis' life comes from his own autobiography.
Oh.
So that will be written later in our story, but that colors things because most of what we know about him is from his side of the story. And of course, tales of what he did at 11 are according to himself.
Okay.
So maybe he wasn't a great kid. Maybe he was a brat, but he would have seen himself like that. And this is important because we actually don't know these things. Anyway, when he's 16, he desperately falls in love with a gal named Elizabeth. And she's 12 at the time, but different time, you know.
No, that seems just...
Yeah, it was a thing that people did at the time. It seems really weird. But Elizabeth is not royalty, but basically royalty. Like, she's at a higher caste. Her family is higher class.
Lords and ladies or something?
Sort of. And he's a lowly carpenter. And,
like Jesus.
And Elizabeth's family didn't want her to marry Jacob. Not because she was 12. That was not a factor. Just because Jacob was a carpenter.
Okay.
They were okay with the 12-16 thing. In fact, they went on to hook Elizabeth up with an even older guy who was a soldier, but apparently had a more acceptable career for them.
Okay.
So Jacob takes like $50 and a gold watch that he's put one of Elizabeth's hairs inside of.
Whoa.
And he goes to America.
Sweet and creepy? Mostly just creepy.
Yeah, I think it would have been time for him to move on, but he never moved on from Elizabeth. And so he comes to America in 1870, and it's hard times because America is the land of opportunity, but there are a lot of people looking for opportunity. It's flooded with immigrants from all over the world.
Yeah, so 1870, so New York is kind of booming with immigrants, and there are a lot of people from all over the world there, concentrated there.
Yeah, booming is a good word for it. And in fact, there are so many immigrants coming in that New York cannot possibly handle it.
Wow.
So the conditions are really tough. People are desperate for work, which means work is hard to find, and the work that there is pays very, very little because of supply and demand, but also a lack of labor regulations and stuff. So he's this, again, according to him, this very idealistic and honest guy. And he goes through a series of problems where he's exploited by various bosses. He's robbed, and he seems to be a hardworking and skilled guy doing his best. But he even gets his gold watch and the hair stolen, and he never ends up finding it again. Yeah, don't worry, he'll get more hair later.
Ew, I don't know what that means, but I don't know if we should go on.
He goes through a series of different jobs and eventually ditches the carpentry job and takes a job as a reporter at the New York News Association. You can't
get lords and ladies with a carpentry job.
Right? And he works his way up. He's a good reporter. And eventually he's promoted to the editor. But as an editor, he's not real thrilled with the fact that politicians own the newspaper because they kind of restrict what he can and can't write.
And he's idealistic.
He is very idealistic. So he scrounges up enough money to actually buy that newspaper. And so now he has more creative control. And so he can expand what he's writing about a little bit. But he gets a letter from Denmark.
What's that?
It has terrible news, but also good news, bad news, that kind of thing. The bad news is Elizabeth's fiance died of a terrible disease.
Oh.
The good news is Elizabeth's fiance died of a terrible disease. So he writes back and he's like, hey, Elizabeth.
You still 12?
She's some older now. I don't know how old, but let's say it's an appropriate age now to get married. And anyway, she agrees. She will marry him. He just needs to come back to Denmark. They don't immediately plan to return to the U.S., but he sells his newspaper, makes a healthy profit, sells it for 500% more. He actually sells it back to the politicians. So I guess he developed the business. He gets out of New York with his big wad of money, marries Elizabeth, and then not too much longer, they come back to New York City because that's just where he wants to be. So now he starts working again as a reporter for a little paper called the New York Tribune. And it's
that old?
Yeah. And he's the police reporter. So he's covering like the police news, crime and stuff. Wow. And he's working in the slums. And so he's in and out of these kind of awful conditions all day. And well, I am speaking right now. It's a little difficult for me to paint a picture, but he was having the same challenge in portraying what was going on in those conditions because he just was a writer. He was just writing everything in words. And there were tenements, there were buildings packed with, 5, 10, 15 people sleeping in a room.
And these were slums, so they probably didn't have they probably weren't appropriately equipped with running water and plumbing and things like that.
No. Yeah. And walls would sometimes crumble. And, kids worked. But people lived there because the landlords charged not so much money. Previously these buildings had been occupied by fewer families and charged more rent. But with this influx of immigrants, more and more landlords just said, hey, for some super cheap amount of money, we'll pack you all into this small amount of space. And people agreed because they needed a place to stay and they had some amount of work in New York. But the conditions sucked. It sucked for the grown-ups. It sucked for the kids. And there was lots of crime and stuff. So he had a hard time painting this picture with words. I mean, I'm sure he was a lovely writer, but people reading the newspaper didn't seem to care. And he didn't just want to do his job. He wanted people to read it, care, and take action to change it because he wasn't happy with these conditions.
And how could they connect to something that they'd never seen? They could try to envision it in words, but words require your imagination. If you're not living in a slum, if you haven't seen one, then you wouldn't be able to conjure the appropriate image.
That's a good point. How do you create a point of reference when people don't yet have one?
Yeah.
Because the newspaper readers were not the people that he was writing about. They were isolated from the slums. New York, not unlike it is now, but it had a rich and a poor, and they were separate. This is like the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is like where I lived when I was there, which when I lived there was in much better conditions than when he lived there. But it's not nearly as nice as it is now. It's much better now. It was not great then. So he was not a good drawer. He did try drawing stuff, but it didn't work out. It didn't convey emotionally.
I just imagine people reading his article and looking at a really terrible drawing and being like, what am I?
Just a big sad face.
Supposed to feel right now.
So photography it's out there now. It's coming out. They don't have great equipment. So you need bright light, sunny conditions. You need people to hold still.
And a lot of cameras were cumbersome and required a tripod. It's not like you can just pull up your camera and snap a picture.
Yeah, everything pretty much required a tripod, including the stuff that he was doing. But he used the camera some during the daylight and was able to capture some of these, and some of those pictures would go into the article. But one of the big innovations that he had was that he wanted to capture the world at night because he felt like I don't know, I guess he just felt like that's when it conveyed the best. So he took magnesium, which people were using for flashes, and his innovation is he kind of made it a little more portable. So he put it on basically like a gun grip almost. In fact, he later had to redesign his sort of gun grip flash because people found it threatening. So he made it into something that looked a little bit less threatening. But some people consider him to be the father of flash photography because of these innovations. So he's bringing the flash into these dark environments. And the way he tells it, he's sneaking into these slums, and the people in the slums, they only see a few shadowy figures because he worked with other people, a little bit of movement, and then a bright flash. And then he was gone.
Like he's like the Batman of slum photography.
Exactly.
Yeah. How did other people see it? Was there any, did anyone remember him coming in or?
Yeah. Other people say he would just stage everything. He would just pull a couple of kids in and put them in locations.
Isn't that just the way?
Well, it does bring up an interesting point of debate because is that okay? If he poses people in a way that's realistic in their actual conditions, but technically he wouldn't have been able to get a candid photo. So he tried to pose candid photos, make people do what they were going to do. You can't sneak that gear in and get a candid photo.
No, but you can just kind of be honest about it.
Yeah. So I suppose he is. It seems certain that some of these pictures are posed because as we look at them and we say, oh, yeah, I can see this kid's smiling a little bit when he's supposed to be asleep and things like that. So some of these pictures are posed.
Kids will ruin everything. That was his first mistake.
Yeah. So he has a difficult time getting it published in a wider audience than just his newspaper. And for example, Harper's wanted to use his pictures, but he wrote an article with it and they said, we like your pictures, but not your article. We're going to have somebody else write the article.
Ooh.
And he was like, no. And I don't know why he didn't let that go. Maybe he was afraid the writer wouldn't tell a true story or whatever, but he passed on it and instead decided he was going to just reach people directly by going to churches and lecturing and kind of putting on a slideshow.
So his heart was in the right place. He just wanted to help these people.
I think his heart was sincerely in the right place. I do think he was a vain person who was concerned about his self-image. But at the same time, I do think his heart was in the right place. So in 1890, he writes How the Other Half Lives, about the tenements in Lower East Side Manhattan. And you can tell from the title how he's positioning it, How the Other Half Lives. It's written for the rich half about the poor half.
Yeah.
He wants to bring their story to the people who have the resources to change things.
They wouldn't like that. That would be uncomfortable.
He does make people uncomfortable, and by going to places where people are, at churches and such, he's already confronting them with this imagery. He writes like 10 pages with pictures, and the newspapers won't publish it because it's too dark. It's not something people want to see.
What a bizarre concept that just reality could be too dark.
Well, yeah, I don't think that's a problem with modern media. I think they tend to latch on to that kind of thing. Scribner's a book publisher does. So he publishes a longer version of it as a book. And it is successful. And to this day, it's really well known. But what happened is enough people saw this that they started to take action. And things changed. Teddy Roosevelt saw the book and reached out to him.
Wow.
Yeah, he was a president.
Yeah.
He was a really big deal. So as a result, we started to get plumbing, sewage.
So he actually helped them. So he showed these terrible conditions, and then they actually responded by trying to make them better. But then where did the people go?
Well, yeah, they tore down a lot of the tenements. They just leveled this stuff.
And
then what, right?
Yeah,
so this is one of the controversial aspects of Jacob Riis is he did close down these homes, but the people, their choice was really to move into better and more expensive conditions. And a lot of people said, these conditions suck. But I have more money. I have enough money to go live someplace better. It's just I'm sending most of my money to my family overseas. That's why I'm living here. I'm sacrificing for my family.
What about the people that didn't have the money?
Right. I don't know. Nothing I saw said they set up better shelters for people.
Yeah.
Just that they tore down what was there and, sent people off to live in presumably more expensive housings. But that was one of the big criticisms. So he definitely changed conditions, and it was a change that he wanted to effect, and he was successful at that. And his images did that. It speaks to the power of the pictures, that he could change the landscape of a big part of New York City and the experience of all these immigrants.
What a bizarre concept, because he was going in and thinking that their conditions weren't good enough, but they were choosing to live in worse conditions to send money back to their family.
Yeah, well, each of the immigrants would have had a different story, right?
Yeah.
Some of them might have been forced to be there. The kids certainly had no choice. A lot of it was child labor. But you're right, he did shut down an option, as terrible as it was.
Yeah.
It was at that point, all those people chose that option. It was a free country. So it's controversial. Yeah. And I'm not sure what the right answer is.
But me either.
Today, we definitely owe some amount of, proper hygiene and cleanliness, especially in New York City, but worldwide to his work. One of the big risks, of course, in living in those conditions without proper sewage and running water is the spread of disease. And that was really common in a lot of places. And people credit him with kind of preventing that epidemic from striking. So he could have saved, millions of lives.
I wonder if this was around the time of typhoid.
I'm not sure.
Because there was a huge typhoid breakout in New York City, and part of it was because it wasn't very clean.
Yeah. So looking at a few of his pictures here, in this example, this one to me reads as staged, and we'll probably never know for sure, but we have 3 kids clustered at the bottom of a set of stairs, kind of surrounded by rubble, and they're posed to be sleeping on this barrel, but their expressions on their faces tell me that they're not actually sleeping. This one happens to be taken in daylight, but I do believe that they're kids living in squalor. Like, those are their real clothes. Those are their real tattered shoes. Mm-hmm. They still dress better than kids nowadays. They have like nice hats and jackets and stuff.
Yeah. I'll take that over Under Armour sweatshirts any day.
I don't even know how to describe these two. Are they kids? Their outfit is so funny. They have like hoods on. Just looking at another picture.
Lighting is excellent.
Yeah, a lot of these pictures are just really pretty. I have a quote here from Jacob. He says, "Our party carried terror wherever it went."
What does he mean, his party?
That's part of him telling the story of going out into the night and taking these flash photos.
What?
Yeah, he had a bit of a flair for the drama as he spoke of himself. Here's another picture of what looks to me like it might be the same three kids, clustered again in another spot, kind of sleeping on each other. And what do you think? Do you think that's a candid picture or a staged photo?
I don't know. I can't see their faces.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Certainly, to set up a tripod and the flash and everything, it seems like it would have disturbed kids. And
Mm-hmm.
it seems like to stage that definitely would have been the easier thing to do. Would you care to describe this picture, Chelsea?
Oh boy, what is that on the wall?
That's funny that that's where your eye goes. I think it's probably just their laundry.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, what we have here is a tenement room with, I can definitely see 5 people sleeping in really small quarters. The walls seem to be made of concrete. Every surface is covered. There's, shelves with bins and probably everything that they own, some pots and pans. It's very basic living conditions, but, people have blankets and kind of hobbled together beds. But it's a story of a group of immigrants living in conditions that were not great.
I like this picture.
This is a beautiful picture. The lighting is streaming in through big windows on the right side of the frame. And it's a beautiful picture, but it's a picture of child labor, basically.
Yeah.
Like a young kid who's working in some sort of factory. And there was a lot of that going on in New York at the
But
time.
it actually connects you to that story because it can be so difficult to actually visualize what happens or what was happening.
Right. And so, yeah, it's maybe a 10 or 11-year-old kid, a boy who's working in factory conditions. And in this photo, we see a corner of a New York alley. It seems like there's laundry hanging from a wire, and a mother and it looks like a group of 8 kids are gathered around in dirty conditions. There's rubble and trash. Big blocks of concrete seem to have just fallen and stayed in place, and people are just kind of collected around them. They're conditions that you might see in third world places now, but in New York. So here we have what looks like a bar scene.
Oh, he's on a barrel.
Yeah, he's on a barrel, kind of looking at the camera, almost surprised. This is definitely one of his flash shots. The flash is a very distinct signature of being kind of overexposed in the middle and then very dark as you fade farther and farther away from the camera, as it would be. And,
What is this?
Another photo of sleeping conditions. We see
wow.
a very torn up room where the walls are tattered and dirty. There's one candle against one wall, and people are just kind of sleeping on the floor in this very crowded room. Again, it's very distinctly a night flash shot, something that was very unique at the time. So the people in the front are very bright. The people in the far corner are very dark. Whether or not the people knew about this happening, I don't know. So most of his pictures kind of look like this. It's just various stages of poverty in New York City.
Yeah.
Very crowded
It
conditions.
looks terrible.
Here's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt about Jacob. "The countless evils which lurk in the dark corners of our civic institutions, which stalk abroad in the slums and have their permanent abode in the crowded tenement houses, have met in Mr. Riis the most formidable opponent encountered by them in New York City."
Oh, wow. To have the president say that about your photography,
Right.
about your life's mission.
But here's the thing about that quote. It was Teddy Roosevelt wrote that in exchange for Jacob Riis writing a biography about him.
Oh.
I know, right? It feels like, once you find out it wasn't just something he spontaneously said, but part of an exchange.
Yeah.
And so what I took from it, especially in the context of my own writing experience, is that there was a lot of Jacob Riis kind of shaping his own public image. And so since I'm hearing the story from Jacob Riis, it's hard for me to know what actually happened.
Yeah, I mean, that's a story as old as time, I think. People do that now. You get to shape your own identity.
Absolutely. And as writers and as photographers, that's something that happens all the time. He shaped the story that he was telling by the way he composed the pictures, by the way he posed, the pictures to make the conditions seem desperate.
Well,
They
do you
really were
remember
desperate.
in our last podcast when Dorothea Lange took a picture of Florence, the migrant mother picture, and her story was so much different than the subject story?
Dorothea Lange was supposedly inspired by Jacob Riis, and that picture in particular is said to have been inspired by his work.
Wow.
In particular, because of the fact that she posed that picture, just like he often posed these pictures.
Yeah.
So it is directly related, and it is a common theme that we see going on today. Nonetheless, it's hard to argue that he affected change, and it was the change that he wanted to do. He wrote a lot, and pretty much everybody who
Why
published...
does this say racist?
Because he was definitely racist. This you can't argue with, because you can just read his own writing. By today's standards, really racist guy. And it almost goes back to the fact that at the time, him getting engaged to a 12-year-old was like, that's grand. People actually at the time said that, some people suggest that he actually wasn't that racist, but he pretended to be more racist than he actually was in order to make it easier for the middle class to relate to him. So he said a lot of negative things about, well, every ethnicity.
Wow.
Yeah, who knows? But yeah, he definitely wrote stuff that we would consider today to be racist. If reading his autobiography, it's hard to, he was vain.
Wait, so why? So people should know about him because he used his photography to make this change, or?
Right. And because he was basically the father of this type of flash photography and one of the most influential people in founding photojournalism. All of photojournalism changed from that point forward. Photographs became much more common in newspapers and magazines as a direct result of Jacob Riis and the work that he did. He's an important figure in photography, whether or not you agree with everything he did or anything that he did.
Yeah, I think that's an important lesson to the people that we teach photography. You know, we have our group and we teach people exposure and composition. But one thing that people struggle with is their personal style and also, I think, their personal purpose. And the story behind a lot of these people is that they innovated, they did something different, and it worked out because no one had done it before, so it was interesting. And they really believed in it, so it was convincing.
So his wife Elizabeth died when he was 50, and he was devastated. I just thought this was so sweet because he always called her his little lamb. And this is a picture of her tombstone, which has a little ceramic lamb on it. He's stored in, why can't I find the right word? He's buried in a cemetery in Barre, Massachusetts, which is right next to where I used to live, like right between my house and Bob's house. A point of reference everybody listening will certainly get.
Just between Tony and Bob.
It's marked only by a big rock. George Shiras III. He is one of the founders of wildlife photography. He is the first photographer ever to be published in National Geographic, and he went on to have 6, I think, articles published in National Geographic. He's the reason National Geographic has pictures.
No.
He is...
National Geographic didn't have pictures?
Right.
People just read words?
They just read words, if you can imagine. And he also developed something brand new, something that didn't exist before, which is night photography for wildlife.
Whoa.
George is the son, George Shiras III. Can you guess his dad's name?
George Shiras II?
Junior. George Shiras Jr. was a prominent political figure and also very, very wealthy, as his father had been.
A lot of photographers I researched come from wealthy families. Ansel Adams, some other people, whatever, a lot of them.
George Shiras II and III both graduated like Yale. They both had their law degrees, and they both had successful practices. And in fact, at one point, his dad was making about $1.7 million a year working as a lawyer for the railroad.
Then money or now money?
In now money. It was like $75K a year at the time. So he was really bringing it in. They had lots of money to work with. But to me, that's almost a nice part of the story because it's not like George Shiras III just went out and partied. He was a nature boy. He grew up hunting and spending a lot of time in wildlife. And in 1889, he started photography. At the time, he was living in Michigan near Lake Superior, and he already had this appreciation for the animals. And he started using a technique that had been developed by the American Indians. What the American Indians would do is they would take one of their canoes and they'd make a platform in the front of the canoe and they'd set a little fire.
Whoa.
And they'd hang out at the back of the canoe with a bow and arrow. They'd go out at night, and as they're going down the river, deer, elk, whatever.
They're like, what the hell?
Yeah, and they would just like stare at the light. You know how deer do with your car.
Yeah.
And then you pull the bow and arrow, you point right between the shiny eyes that are reflecting back at you, and you get yourself some food. So he applied this technique to wildlife photography.
That's interesting because we now often mimic what hunters do for our wildlife photography as well.
Yeah, all of wildlife photography has been learned from hunting because people have been hunting for way longer, as well as biology. And so George got to really know the animals really well, and he was seeing the nocturnal behaviors of animals that even people in the wilderness never really saw.
Wow.
Because you sleep at night and it's hard to see stuff. So not only was he witnessing it himself, but he was documenting it. And these pictures were so remarkable that they got a lot of attention. And in fact, he went on to win the grand prize at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And this publicity got the attention of National Geographic, who reached out to him.
Holy moly.
Yep, they published 74 of his photos in 1906, along with an article about nocturnal behaviors of animals and the processes that he was using. He did a lot more than just take pictures of animals.
What else did he do?
Because he was involved in legislature. He was in the House of Representatives.
Went to Yale, innovated night wildlife photography.
Maybe that's why he had to do night photography, as he clearly was busy during the day and just never slept.
He just had to fill the rest of his hours. He's a vampire. Or what else?
But he helped to pass the Migratory Bird Bill of 1913. He helped to establish several national parks and refuges.
He discovered new species as well, right?
Yep. He discovered a new subspecies of moose in Yellowstone, which is now known as the Shiras moose.
Ooh, because it likes wine.
No, it's named after him. I might be mispronouncing his last name.
He wanted to replace rifle hunting with camera hunting.
Right, exactly.
How'd that work out for him?
Well, I think it worked out. I think a lot of us wildlife photographers have followed in his tracks. And I've actually tried to make the same pitch to my friends who are hunters, because they talk about how they do it because they love wildlife. And wildlife photography is at least as challenging as hunting.
Have you converted any of them?
No.
You know why? It's because they're not into photography.
So when you look at George's pictures, they are immediately haunting because they're taken at night and you're seeing the animals just doing what they do. Like this picture of a moose, as moose do, he's elbow deep in a pond, but the flash is reflecting off of the fog in the foreground.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful.
And the glossy coat of the moose, who doesn't seem to know what's going on, but
it's like, what the?
It's not taken with a telephoto lens. George is really close to this big and dangerous animal.
He's a wild man.
And here we see a porcupine.
A white porcupine?
Yeah, I don't know if the porcupine is actually albino or if that's a property of the flash bouncing off of him. But the porcupine is definitely white, and porcupines are mostly nocturnal. So they're the kind of animal you don't see out and about. They're prominent in this area, but we almost never see them. Sometimes you'll spot them sleeping in a tree.
We have porcupine here?
We do, but you never see them, right? If you look up in the trees a lot, you will occasionally see a porcupine sleeping up there.
I don't even believe you.
So here's a couple of deer, and actually they're pretty much solid white too. So maybe this is just the property of the flash that he was using, and probably the steep fall off of light, because the woods behind them are completely black, but they're completely white. So he's probably close enough that the exposure is tough.
How close he got.
Yeah, and can I just say, it's not like he put the flash in his hot shoe. He's using, he's firing magnesium like Jacob was, but what you do, they're not linked up. Like you take the cap off of your lens, you open the shutter, you fire the flash with some sort of ignition, and then you cover the shutter back up. It's a very manual and disconnected process. Wow. So the film is only exposed for the duration of the flash, but as a result, there's almost always some movement in the pictures. Here's a haunting picture of what looks to be a bobcat at the edge of the river, and there's this beautiful reflection.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Of the bobcat.
I feel like you'd crop that if it were on our live show.
I definitely would, but in fairness, it would have been kind of difficult for him to compose this.
Yes, of course.
And he didn't have a big zoom lens. Anyway, this is George Shiras III, and he had a remarkable impact on wildlife photography and wildlife overall. He did great things.
He helped preserve it.
Right, and we are all just standing on his shoulders with the work that we do. So thank you for the work that you've done. This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace.
What?
Is the all-in-one hosting provider. You know this better than I do.
Squarespace, they make you lunch.
Squarespace makes awesome websites that make your photos look great. So whether you're Jacob Riis or George Shiras or just you doing the best that you can with your camera, your pictures will look best when you set up a portfolio on Squarespace. It starts at $9 a month, and each site comes with a store, analytics, so you can see who's visiting your site, how many pictures you're going through. And speaking for myself, my own Squarespace website has taught me a lot about photography. I can see the pictures that engage people most, how deeply people get into the pictures, and it helps me share just my best work, because your Facebook, your Twitter, your 500 pixels, not your best pictures. A portfolio makes you look better by showing off just a handful of your best pictures in a way that makes them look fantastic, whether it's on a PC or a mobile device. So thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring this podcast.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time with a topic we've not yet determined.
Yeah, I will probably cover this topic again, too. So many great photographers.
Yep. If you're watching on YouTube, you can tell us, you can suggest future photographers. And if you want to hear the podcast, go to stp.io/podcast, where you can get the audio version of it. Thanks
so much.